thanks for being willing to talk more about Origin.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm excited.
Part of it is that you seemed pretty pumped about it, and part of it is that I can't resist the chance to look at dice pool mechanics from the standpoint of someone else's priorities.
Mm,
Um, I'm quite fond of the little boogers, and
right.
um, even though I always say that from a consulting standpoint, I don't want to impose my preferences in the few moments when the opportunity arises that I can get away with it,
Mhm.
I'm taking it.
Right.
So the fundamental idea is that, if I'm paraphrasing so you can correct me,
Mhm.
is that Origin will, through if not one role, perhaps several, but Origin will deliver decisive outcomes, so that if we have a clash, or if we have a slam, or if we have one of these conflicts of values,
Mhm.
someone's going down.
Right.
And I think that's an important point, that we don't see a whole lot of the kind of comic book fighting art where one person is doing this
Right.
and the other one's doing this, right? What we're seeing is the closure of the
Right.
action more often than not. Even if
Yeah.
that action doesn't finish things, we get to watch. It's one of those Sal Buscema punches,
Mm.
where the picture is of the hero on follow through, and the guy he punched is like in the air, upside down.
Right.
That's the classic.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, um, let's take a look at what a dice pool can do that a fixed number of dice or a single die engaged with a target number cannot.
Right.
The first thing is that, as I implied in my discussion of early White Wolf and Sorcerer mechanics, it is a little dangerous to get seduced by the number of available variables.
Mm.
If you have to adjust all of them, then your understanding of the distribution gets out of hand. Here are the
Right.
three that are the most obvious. Number one is, obviously, the number of dice. I have yet to hear anybody quite tell me without being angry whether rolling several dice at a consistent number is still a dice pool. As far as I can tell, people are happiest thinking of a pool of dice as a variable number of dice.
Right.
The other variable of three is the size of the dice.
Mm.
And the third variable is, if any, a fixed value that we compare the values against.
Right.
I said if any, but in many ways there is always something to look at that third one first. You could, for example, like Burning Wheel, say every die is a coin, and you're counting the number of heads, and then you're comparing that to what some other roll did in the same metric.
Mm.
So it's still a target number. You're looking at
Right.
what the other roll did.
Right.
So, okay, so those three variables. The question is, do we want all three of those variables to be active at all times? By active, what I mean is can be changed by some aspect of the situation.
Right.
If we're seduced by that, then we will have a way to change each one of those variables due to circumstance or something on the sheet.
Mm.
And frankly, that is a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
It's way too many things to fiddle with, and it turns the actual assessment of what your dice actually do quantitatively into this sludge. So is that making any sense?
Yeah.
So far, and so painful as it is, I mean, the sort of, I guess, little voice in me which wants everything to mean everything in every possible way when you use an instrument has to get beaten to death. And we have to say, hold on, we want to pare it down and look at what the dice pool is supposed to be doing. Are we going to focus on this individual having more dice or less dice than that individual for this time, which is what Sorcerer does? Are we going to focus on what happens to the target number? Or is the target number going to be a very easy thing that's checked very consistently every single time and can be instantly forgotten as soon as it's used? Or are we going to think, oh, yes, I forgot one of my other variables. I had number of dice. Did I talk about the size of the dice, the type of dice?
You mentioned size of die.
Right. So we're all gamers here. We've got D4 through D20. And yes, I know that Zoki has gone berserk ever since, the technology improved. We've got our D7s, we've got our D100s, and, that's fine. We'll let the perverts do as they will. We all know that it's really properly about D4, D6, D8, D10, and D12. And technically D20. So with that and sadly, D8s and D12s, which numerically speaking are actually very coherent little objects, being much more divisible than any of the other dice, are sadly screwed in gaming culture, and nobody respects them, which is just bad, but true for some reason. So anyway, what happens if we look at the size of the dice? What's weird about a dice pool is that you have an opportunity to do something that very, very few games do. Sorcerer does not, which is to vary the size of the dice individually in a given dice pool.
Yeah.
So the dice pool could be a handful of differently sized dice. Very, very few games have messed with that, and preferring to focus on the other variables.
Yeah.
One of the very few is Jason Morningstar's The Shabalhiri Roach, which does. Now, one of the reasons is that counting up the totals of a die pool is a rare thing to do. Roll 8 dice, or 6 dice, or 5 dice, or 14 dice, and count them all up and take the sum.
Right.
This is not... I think people got their fair dose of that back in the day and said, that's enough of that silliness, and found other ways to read dice.
Right.
And I should point out that the original version of the Shabalhiri Roach, you did total them up. And in the published version, you took the highest value. Let's look at that game a little closer in this regard. One of the interesting things about the original, and since you really only rolled like a few dice, you didn't roll 15 dice, you rolled a few.
Right.
It was worth it to get another die in there, even if it was just a D4. And the D4 at least had a chance to outdo the D6 that was worth thinking about. And if your D12 crapped out on you, then you still had your D4 there to see if you could beat his high D6, if that's the best he could get. See what I mean?
Right.
So, after all, the D12 only has a 50% chance of beating the maximum of the D6. So, see what I mean? There was a reason to want to pack the die pool, even if you were forced to go for smaller dice.
Right.
Now, on the other hand, when they shifted to go to the highest die, I found that what it meant in the Shabalhiri Roach is that all of a sudden all the smaller dice just disappeared from your thoughts. They really weren't going to be able to deliver anything worth the effort that it took to process them in the first place.
Mm.
And so, I'll take a D10 and a D12 over, if I have a D10 and a D12 and you have a D10 and a D12, really doesn't mean much for me to have 4 or 5 D4s thrown in there with it.
Mm.
Whereas if you're taking the sum, the D4s are at least contributing something, no matter what.
Right.
Even if it's not a maximum value. A 3 is still a fucking 3, and that's half a D6. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see how we have to think about the way the dice are read at the same time as we're thinking about whether the size of the dice is something that we're allowing to be variable?
Yeah.
So changing that is extraordinarily significant,
Mm.
especially if you're going to be reading the highest value.
Yeah.